The Indian steel industry produces nearly 143 million tons of crude steel in FY24. It contributes nearly 2% to the entire GDP of the Indian economy. India's steel capacity is expected to triple by 2040. Even industry giants like JSW, Tata Steel are facing the brunt and are raising arms. India is the second largest steel producer in the world, right behind China. We have more capacity under development even compared to China. So despite all of our massive output, the domestic steel industry is under serious pressure right now, especially from cheap foreign imports. In 2024 and 2025, for the first time in 9 years, India turned into a net importer of steel after 9 years of being a net exporter. In today's video, we will look at 5 things. The first is the Indian steel industry post 1991. From there, we'll sort of start talking about how cheap steel dumping is working. We'll also look at what the government is doing in terms of intervention and what the actual problem is. Finally, we'll start looking into the traceability trap, and ultimately we'll discuss who is going to really benefit from the government's intervention in this process. So let's get into it. So let's understand the steel industry a bit first. The Indian steel industry produces nearly 143 million tons of crude steel in FY24, and that's no small feat. It contributes nearly 2% to the entire GDP of the Indian economy, and it employs millions of people. Everything from cars to bridges to the bars that are there in your apartment, all of that is dependent on this one industry. Post-independence, the Indian government had set prices. They were doing massive production. They were managing the production. They were handing out industrial licenses to large players. And it was essentially a very tightly controlled import for the steel industry. This was a classic case of hands-on industrial strategy by the government, and it worked for a while. Now, in 1991, when the Indian economy underwent liberalization, the steel industry also went through it. It entered a free market era. But this wasn't a complete break. The markets were opened up. The government never really fully let go. Protectionism to a degree still remained to protect the larger players, to protect the domestic industry, and this was being done in a very subtle and strategic way. As we move forward to, let's say, 2017, the Indian steel sector started facing a lot of pressure. So the government rolled out something known as the National Steel Policy 2017. The goal of this policy was to expand crude steel capacity from 125 million tons per annum to 300 million tons per annum by 2030. Now that is nearly more than double in just a decade. By FY23, the capacity had already climbed to 161 million tons per annum. And at the current rates, India's steel capacity is expected to triple by 2040 compared to the 2017 levels. That puts India ahead of every other country, even China, in terms of the steel making capacity that we have under development. And because of the scale of the industry and the production that's happening, there is an attack that's happening here which is known as dumping. So what is dumping? Dumping is when countries export goods at prices that are lower than what it costs for them to make it. Sometimes they do this just to clear any excess supply that's there in the system. Sometimes they do it to gain a market share in other countries' economies. India has subsequently accused countries like China, South Korea, Indonesia, even Japan for doing exactly this dumping practice. And the numbers show the real picture. India is a net importer of finished steel for the first time in the second year in a row. Steel imports have hit a 9-year high at around 9.5 million metric tons. Imports overall have jumped nearly 20% on a year-on-year basis, while exports have fallen. Now, this is a nightmare for domestic producers. Smaller steel mills started scaling down. Even industry giants like JSW, Tata Steel are facing the brunt and are raising arms. They're lobbying the government. And ultimately, it is about the profitability, it's about the money that these companies are earning. But steel is also a strategic asset for the country. It is critical for our defense, it is critical for our construction capabilities, it has an impact on national security. And when supply chains are shifting globally to different countries and the reliance on China is being questioned, India naturally wants control of this very core material that is important for a lot of our industries. So, based on industry pressure and lobbying, the government stepped in 2013. The Director General of Trade Remedies, they stepped in. They launched an investigation into the sector, and by early 2024, they recommended a 12% safeguard duty on certain steel products for about 200 days. But that was just the beginning. The government had another set of protectionism measures that they wanted to employ. First, safeguard duties, temporary tariff hikes that we discussed of 12% hike. Second was minimum import prices. So they started setting floor in prices for imports. There is quality control orders, so mandating BIS certified quality standards for the sector. Anti-dumping duties were introduced. Extra charges were being levied on underpriced foreign goods. These are often layered together. Governments don't just employ one tactic, they will use different policies to achieve the end objective. And ultimately, the idea here is to deploy a fortress or a protection for the domestic producers. And it's not just India that's doing this, it's countries all over the world, especially those that are facing such dumping practices from China and are taking similar steps to protect not just their steel sectors but other sectors as well. But there is a problem here, which is that by protecting steel producers, which is a great part of the policy, what happens to people that are using the steel product? India's micro, small and medium enterprises, also known as MSMEs, these are the ones who are typically making everything from spoons to scaffolding, and they're the ones who are taking the hit because they are the end consumer of some of these finished products that the larger players are making. And worse still, a lot of these MSMEs need specialized grades of steel that India typically doesn't provide and need to be imported in larger quantities from foreign markets. And now those imports that are critical to these MSMEs are tangled in red tape, they have higher duties, there's a sudden change in rules that require these raw materials from other countries to also meet Indian BIS standards, and this is known as the traceability trap. It's a bureaucratic headache that could kill small businesses. So let's break down the traceability trap. On June 13th, the Ministry of Steel dropped a new QCO rulebook that basically took effect just 3 days later on June 16th. The rule said this: if a company, let's say is in Vietnam, wants to export steel to India, not only does their final product need Indian certification, so do the raw materials that they use, like let's say slabs that are coming in from Malaysia. Suddenly, a lot of these small Indian importers are being asked to prove that a third-party supplier halfway across the world has certification from the Bureau of Indian Standards, BIS. And there's no time to prepare, there's no real support, and all you get are 3 days for this compliance change to take effect. And as you can imagine, it's not just stressful, it's expensive. The compliances typically are quite expensive. Some companies already have paid for certain shipments, and when they are arriving, they may not be allowed into the country. The Global Trade Research Initiative also looked at the sector and has warned about potential panic with plant closures, job losses coming in for the sector. And MSMEs don't have the necessary pressure or the power to put pressure on their foreign suppliers to get them to jump through the BIS hoops. So in effect, these MSMEs' entire supply chain is stuck. They're either having to pay more for Indian steel or they may have to shut down. And the government's help is somewhat complicated. They promise something known as the export parity pricing. Basically, steel producers will either get subsidies or be forced to offer lower prices to these MSMEs so that they could still access affordable materials. But one, the scheme is only for certain types of steel. Two, there's no central portal for applying for these things. And ultimately, the application process can be quite messy and is full of lots of conditions. So what was the impact of all of this? Well, imports from January to May of 2025 have dropped nearly 20% compared to last year, signaling that the recently introduced safeguard of 12% along with the other measures, which have been active since mid-April, are already causing a slowdown in imports for the Indian steel industry. And if we sort of start digging deeper, we start seeing that South Korea led the exporters in India with a 26% share. China had 20%, followed by Vietnam, who recently took over Japan. Most of the imported products were also flat steel. These are hot rolled coils, galvanized steel sheets, electrical steel. All of this comprised of nearly 62% of the April to May shipments. But with global hot coil prices already well below what Indian safeguard was at, which is a threshold of $675 per ton, the 12% duty is already acting as a very strong deterrent. The return of competitively priced Russian HRC, which is now also BIS certified, has added another twist. But ultimately, with new rules mandating this BIS compliance across the entire steel industry supply chain, which is effective from June 16th, has meant that there is a tightening of imports, which are especially being rerouted or maybe processed, which is ultimately inevitable. So at the end of all of this, who really wins out of all of these measures? Well, the big steel players will win big, such as Tata Steel, which has already seen its best production numbers happening in FY25. Profits have also doubled in Q4 of FY25. JSW Steel has also reported record-breaking production numbers and sales numbers as well. Industry analysts like ICRA are also projecting a capacity utilization of 83% 10% in FY26, which is very healthy since these are large capital intensive projects where the more that they're utilizing their capacity, which means more output is being generated and potentially more sales are happening, which adds to both the top and the bottom line. Even smaller mills are seeing some sort of breather. They have a lifeline potentially, and the sort of policy measures are helping them. The entities that we spoke about earlier, the MSMEs, however, are facing a very different story. They're paying more, they're potentially struggling more with compliance measures, and in some cases may even be on the verge of closure. Ultimately, that is the collateral damage that we are facing right now. While India has protected its finished steel industry, the availability of some of these raw materials that are needed to make steel and making that harder to import, that has ultimately raised costs for Indian producers as well. So now the government has to protect the producers it has made more expensive to ultimately begin with. And it's essentially like patching one hole by poking another. Ultimately, economic policy and industrial policy is quite hard, it's quite complicated. In the Indian steel industry context, these protection measures were meant to be bold, strategic, and maybe even necessary. But it also shows how messy it can be. You can protect one part of the economy, but you might end up hurting another. And like we said earlier, the big steel players are breathing fine, but ultimately the downstream manufacturers, the MSMEs, that is where the bedrock of a majority of the products and exports are happening. Those are potentially being left behind in compliance and red tape. If anything we've learned from this is that the real strength of an economy is obviously the large factories, but it's also the health of the entire supply chain in the whole process. So how India balances these competing interests could ultimately really decide whether India becomes a top steel producer and importer for the overall world by the 2030 or the 2040 mark that was set by the Indian steel policy in 2017. If you found this video helpful and this deep dive helpful, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. It really helps us out. Don't forget to hit that bell icon as well. Do let us know in the comments what other videos you would like us to cover. Till then, happy investing. Thank you.
Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.